May 8, 1945, Berlin. The war in Europe was over. American and Soviet soldiers embraced in the rubble. Awkward, euphoric, exhausted. They had crushed the Nazi war machine together. But 300 miles south, General George S. Patton stood at a window, his jaw tight, eyes staring east, toward the Soviet. In his mind, a new war had already begun. Patton had been saying it for weeks. The Russians are not our allies. They are the enemy. He told anyone who would listen that America should rearm German soldiers and march on Moscow. The Third Army alone could cut through them like butter. In Washington, President Harry Truman, just 26 days in office, read every report. Patton's name appeared again and again. Not in praise, in alarm. The general had called the Soviets Mongolians. He compared them to Nazis. He wanted World War III. When Truman heard what Patton said, he didn't shout. He didn't explode. He spoke quietly. Get him out of Germany before he starts World War III. This is the story of two men, two visions of freedom, and the decision that shaped the Cold War. May 8, 1945, Berlin. The sky over the shattered Reich Chancellery hung thick with smoke and silence. The war in Europe was over. In the rubble-choked streets, American and Soviet soldiers embraced, awkward, euphoric, exhausted. They had crushed the greatest military machine the world had ever known. But beneath the laughter and the lifted bottles of liberated schnapps, something else stirred, something unspoken, a tension that would not be photographed, would not be celebrated, and would not fade with the gun smoke. 300 miles to the south, in a commandeered villa outside Bad Tolz, General George S. Patton Jr. stood at a window, watching his Third Army roll past in endless columns. Tanks, half-tracks, the machinery of victory. But Patton's jaw was tight. His eyes, pale and unblinking, stared not at his men, but through them, toward the east, toward the Soviets. And in his mind, a new war had already begun. He had been saying it for weeks, to his staff, to visiting congressmen, to anyone who would listen. The Russians were not allies. They were the enemy. And if the United States did not act now, immediately, while the armies were still in position, then the blood spilled across Europe would mean nothing. We promised the Europeans freedom from the Germans, he had written in his diary. Now we are turning them over to the Russians. We have won the war, but we are losing the peace. It was not a whisper. It was not a rumor. Patton had said it plainly, loudly, and repeatedly. And in Washington, D.C., in the newly ascended Oval Office, President Harry S. Truman heard every word. Truman had not sought this moment. Just 26 days earlier, he had been vice president, a man kept in the shadows, uninformed, unprepared. Then Franklin Roosevelt died, and the weight of the world fell onto the shoulders of a haberdasher from Missouri. He had not been briefed on the atomic bomb. He had not been consulted on Yalta. He had inherited a war won in Europe and still raging in the Pacific, and now he inherited George Patton, a general whose brilliance was matched only by his recklessness. Truman sat at his desk, reading the intelligence summaries, the reports from theater commanders, the cables from diplomats in Moscow, and again, Patton's name appeared, not in praise, in alarm. The general had called the Soviets Mongolians. He had compared them to the Nazis. He had told a British general that the United States should rearm 2 divisions of the Wehrmacht, yes, German soldiers, and march east with them to Moscow. We can do it easily, Patton had said. The Third Army alone could cut through them like butter. Truman set the report down. His hands were steady, but his mind was not. He understood Patton's rage. The Soviets were carving up Eastern Europe. Poland, the nation for which Britain had gone to war, was being swallowed whole. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, each would fall under Soviet occupation. Their people traded like poker chips at conferences Patton had no part in. The general saw betrayal. He saw cowardice, and he could not stay silent. But Truman saw something else. He saw the fragility of the coalition that had defeated Hitler. He saw the exhaustion of a nation that had sent millions of sons across 2 oceans. He saw the atomic shadow that had not yet fallen on Hiroshima, and he knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the world could not afford another war. Not now, not yet. And so when Truman heard what Patton had said, he did not shout. He did not rage. He spoke quietly to his Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and to his Chief of Staff, George Marshall. Get him out of Germany, Truman said, before he starts World War III. To understand the collision between these 2 men, one a warrior forged in the deserts of North Africa and the hedgerows of France, the other a politician shaped by the wheat fields of Kansas and the wards of Kansas City, You must first understand the war they had just won, and the war that Patton believed was coming. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had always been one of necessity, not affection. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin's regime was on the brink of collapse. The Red Army, gutted by Stalin's purges, reeled backward under the onslaught. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would fall in weeks. Churchill, no friend of communism, nevertheless understood that Britain's survival depended on Russia staying in the fight. If Hitler invaded hell, Churchill quipped, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. When the United States entered the war 6 months later, the alliance became a trinity. Roosevelt, ever the optimist, believed that Stalin could be managed, that the Soviet dictator could be brought into a post-war order based on cooperation and mutual interest. Truman, thrust into Roosevelt's chair, inherited this hope. But he also inherited the reality. Stalin had no intention of liberating Eastern Europe. He intended to dominate it. Patton had seen this from the beginning. As his Third Army drove eastward in the spring of 1945, they encountered the Red Army moving west. The Soviets were supposed to be liberators, but Patton's soldiers saw something different. They saw Soviet troops looting, raping, executing collaborators without trial. They saw entire populations uprooted, packed into boxcars, sent east to Lobar camps. Patton's intelligence officers reported that the NKVD was already operating in occupied territories, rounding up anti-communists, intellectuals, priests. The Iron Curtain, though Churchill would not name it for another year, was already descending. Patton believed that the United States had the power to stop it. His Third Army was the finest fighting force in the world, hardened, mobile, unstoppable. The Soviets, for all their numbers, were exhausted. Their supply lines were stretched across 1,000 miles of devastation. Their tanks, though numerous, were mechanically inferior. Patton had studied them, he had watched them, and he believed with absolute certainty that the Third Army could reach Moscow before winter. But wars are not fought by generals alone. They are fought by nations, and the American nation in May 1945 wanted one thing, to bring the boys home. The American soldier in the spring of 1945 did not dream of Moscow. He dreamed of Main Street, of his girl, of a job, a car, a future that did not include mud and blood and the screams of dying men. The point system, designed to determine who would be discharged first, became an obsession. Men calculated their scores like accountants. Time in service. Time in combat. Wounds. Decorations. Every point was a ticket home. And the idea of turning east, of fighting another war against another ideology, was unthinkable. Patton knew this, but he did not care. In his mind, soldiers were not voters. They were warriors, and warriors did what was necessary, whether they understood it or not. I would rather have a German division in front of me than a Russian division behind me, he told a reporter. The quote made headlines. It enraged the Soviets. It embarrassed the State Department, and it brought Patton one step closer to the end of his career. Truman read the quote in the morning briefing. He did not explode. He did not summon his generals in a fury. Instead, he underlined the passage, folded the paper, and handed it to George Marshall. George, he said, how much longer do we need him? Marshall, ever the diplomat, ever the strategist, understood the question. Patton was indispensable in war, but peace, fragile, uncertain peace, required a different kind of general. We'll reassign him, Marshall said, after the Pacific is settled, but the Pacific would not wait, and neither would Patton. In the months that followed, Patton's rhetoric grew sharper. He was assigned to command the 15th Army, a paper command, a bureaucratic dead end tasked with writing the history of the war. It was a demotion, thinly disguised. Patton knew it, his staff knew it, and the press, always hungry for conflict, sensed blood. At a press conference in September 1945, Patton was asked about denazification, the Allied policy of removing former Nazis from positions of power in occupied Germany. Patton, never one to soften his words, dismissed the policy as naive. This Nazi thing, he said, is just like a Democratic-Republican election fight. The implication was clear. Membership in the Nazi Party was no different than membership in any political party. It was pragmatism, not ideology. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Eisenhower, Patton's old friend, and now the Supreme Commander in Europe, was forced to issue a public rebuke. The press howled. Veteran groups demanded Patton's removal. And in Washington, Truman faced a choice. He could defend Patton. He could argue that the general's brilliance outweighed his recklessness, that his understanding of the Soviet threat was prescient, that history would vindicate him. Or he could do what politics demanded, remove a problem before it became a crisis. Truman chose the latter. On October 2, 1945, Patton was relieved of command. The official statement was diplomatic. Patton would return to the United States. He would be given a hero's welcome. He would retire with full honors. But the message was clear. The age of Patton was over. The age of diplomacy, of containment, of Cold War strategy had begun. Patton never made it home. On December 9, 1945, his staff car collided with an army truck near Mannheim, Germany. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, he died. The warrior who had wanted to fight one last war would never fight again. But what did Truman actually say when he heard Patton's words? The historical record, maddeningly, does not preserve a single dramatic moment. A room where Truman slammed his fist on the desk and shouted Patton's name. Instead, what we have is more revealing. We have the steady accumulation of decisions, the quiet meetings, the cables sent and orders signed. And in those decisions, we see Truman's answer. Truman did not believe Patton was wrong about the Soviets. Within 2 years, the president would authorize the Truman Doctrine, committing the United States to containing Soviet expansion. He would approve the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Europe as a bulwark against communism. He would oversee the Berlin airlift, the formation of NATO, the beginning of the Cold War. Patton's warnings, so inflammatory in 1945, would become official policy by 1947. But Truman also understood what Patton did not, that war is politics by other means, and politics is the art of the possible. In May 1945, it was not possible to march on Moscow. The American people would not support it. The British were spent. The Soviets, for all their flaws, had borne the brunt of the Nazi war machine. 27 million dead, cities reduced to ash. To turn on them immediately would shatter the moral authority the Allies had claimed. It would make the United States the aggressor, and it would plunge the world into a conflict that might never end. So Truman said nothing publicly, but privately to his advisors, he made his position clear. Patton is a brilliant general, he said, but he doesn't understand politics. And this is a political war now. There is a photograph taken in the summer of 1945 that captures the contradiction of that moment. Patton stands in front of a formation of his soldiers, his face carved from granite, his posture rigid. Behind him, an American flag snaps in the wind. In the distance, just visible, is a Soviet banner, red, triumphant, foreign. The two flags do not touch, but they do not need to. The space between them is the future. Patton wanted to close that space with tanks and bullets. Truman chose to close it with money, diplomacy, and the long, grinding patience of containment. History has judged Truman's choice as correct. The Cold War was cold because leaders like Truman refused to let it become hot. But history has also vindicated Patton's warnings. The Soviet Union did become the enemy. The Iron Curtain did descend, and the world would spend the next 45 years locked in a struggle that Patton had foreseen in the ruins of Nazi Germany. But in 1945, Truman could not know how the story would end. He knew only that the war had cost too much in blood, in treasure, in the moral fabric of nations to risk another. And so he made the hardest choice a leader can make. He chose restraint over action, patience over passion, politics over principle, and he sent GeorgePatton home. There is a deeper irony in this story, one that reveals the tragedy of both men. Patton believed in American power because he had wielded it. He had seen what the industrial might of the United States could accomplish when unleashed. Factories that could produce a tank every hour, shipyards that launched a Liberty ship every day, an economy so vast, so abundant, that it could feed and arm half the world while its own citizens enjoyed luxuries that European soldiers could not imagine. Patton had seen German prisoners weep at the sight of American rations, chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat. He had seen Soviet soldiers stare in disbelief at American trucks, American radios, American boots. And he believed, with the fervor of a prophet, that such power carried an obligation to use it. But Truman believed in American power for a different reason. He believed in it because he had lived without it. He had grown up in a nation that was still finding its place in the world. He had fought in the First World War, had seen the waste and futility of that conflict, had returned to a nation that wanted nothing more than to forget. He had watched the Great Depression hollow out towns like his own, had seen men who had once been prosperous reduced to standing in breadlines, and he had learned, slowly and painfully, that power without wisdom is just another form of ruin. Patton wanted to use American power to shape the world. Truman wanted to use it to protect the world. From enemies? Yes, but also from itself. The symbol that runs through this story, the thread that binds it, is not a weapon or a flag. It is a word, freedom. Both men believed in it. Both Both men fought for it, but they defined it differently. For Patton, freedom was the absence of tyrants. It was the destruction of systems, Nazism, communism, that enslaved men. It was the triumph of will, of strength, of the warrior ethos. He believed that freedom had to be won, again and again, on the battlefield. And he believed that the moment you stopped fighting for it, you lost it. For Truman, freedom was the presence of order. It was the ability of ordinary people to live ordinary lives, to work, to raise families, to pursue happiness without fear. It was not the absence of government, but the presence of good government. It was not the absence of conflict, but the management of conflict. And he believed that freedom could be defended without being destroyed in the process. These two definitions collided in 1945, and the collision defined the next half-century. After Patton's death, his diary was published. In it, he had written about the Soviets with a clarity that was startling. The difficulty in understanding the Russian is that we do not take cognizance of the fact that he is not a European, but an Asiatic, and therefore thinks deviously. We can no more understand a Russian than a Chinaman or a Japanese. And from what I have seen of them, I have no particular desire to understand them except to ascertain how much lead or iron it takes to kill them. It is an ugly passage, racist, reductive, but it is also revealing. Patton saw the world in Manichaean terms. Us versus them. Civilization versus barbarism. He could not imagine a world where enemies could become partners, where ideological opposites could coexist. And so, when he looked at the Soviets, he saw only one solution: destroy them before they destroy us. Truman saw the same threat, but he also saw the cost. He saw that another world war, fought with the weapons now at humanity's disposal, would not be a war of liberation. It would be a war of annihilation. The atomic bomb, which Truman had authorized against Japan, had shown what was possible. 2 cities erased in an instant, tens of thousands dead, and that was just the beginning. The scientists were already talking about hydrogen bombs, weapons 1,000 times more powerful. If the Cold War became a hot war, there would be no victory, only ashes. And so, Truman chose the harder path. Not the path of the warrior, but the path of the statesman. Not the path of glory, but the path of survival. In the end, what Truman said when he heard what Patton called the Russians was this: nothing, at least nothing for public consumption. But in the silence, there was an answer. The answer was not a speech or a cable or a dramatic confrontation. It was a decision to remove Patton from command, a decision to prioritize diplomacy over military action, a decision to build a world order based not on the dominance of one power, but on the balance of many. It was not the answer Patton wanted, but it was the answer history required. Decades later, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, it did not fall to American tanks rolling through Red Square. It fell because its system could not compete with the abundance and freedom that Patton had seen in American ration and Truman had seen in American democracy. It fell because the people behind the Iron Curtain wanted what the people in the West had. Not just material wealth, but the right to speak, to worship, to choose. It fell, in other words, because Truman's vision, slow, patient, frustrating, ultimately triumphed over Stalin's tyranny. And in that collapse, you can see the vindication of both men. Patton was right. The Soviets were the enemy. But Truman was also right. The way to defeat them was not through war, but through endurance. There's a moment, late in Patton's life, that captures the tragedy of his final year. He is sitting in his villa, dictating a letter. His career is over. His war is won. But he does not feel victorious. He feels betrayed. I seem to have a facility for doing the wrong thing, he writes, or at least at the wrong time. But Patton did not do the wrong thing. He simply did it at the wrong moment. His warnings about the Soviets were accurate. His calls for action were passionate and sincere. But the world he wanted to save was not ready to be saved, not in the way he envisioned. And so history moved on without him, leaving behind a general who was too brilliant, too bold, and too impatient for the age of diplomacy that followed. Truman, by contrast, understood that great leadership is often the art of not doing something, of resisting the temptation to act, even when action seems just, of choosing the long, uncertain path over the quick, satisfying strike. He did not give Patton his war, and in doing so, he may have saved the world from another. The last image in this story is not of soldiers or statesmen. It is of a simple object, a cigarette. American cigarettes were currency in post-war Europe. A single pack could buy a meal, a night's lodging, a woman's affection. German soldiers hoarded them. Soviet soldiers traded for them. British soldiers envied them. They were more than tobacco. They were a symbol of American abundance, a reminder that while Europe starved, America thrived. Patton saw those cigarettes and believed they proved American superiority. We have more, he thought. Therefore we should lead. Truman saw those cigarettes and believed they proved American responsibility. We have more, he thought. Therefore we must share. Both men were products of the same nation. Both were shaped by the same war, but they carried forward two different visions of what that nation should be. And in the tension between those visions, warrior and statesman, action and restraint, fire and patience, you can see the shape of the world we inherited. When Harry Truman heard what George Patton called the Russians, he did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not grandstand. He simply made a decision, quiet and final, that the age of total war was over, that the future belonged not to the generals who won battles, but to the leaders who prevented them. And in that decision, a new world was born. A world of containment, not conquest, of proxy wars, not world wars, of summits and treaties, and the slow, grinding work of diplomacy. It was not the world Patton wanted, but it was the world he had fought to make possible. Because in the end, the greatest victory is not the one won on the battlefield. It is the one that makes future battlefields unnecessary. And the greatest generals are not the ones who start wars. They are the ones who, by their sacrifice and their vision, make peace imaginable. Patton gave America victory. Truman gave it something harder. The wisdom to know when to stop fighting. And that, perhaps, is what freedom truly means.